China's top diplomats set out on a three-nation trip Tuesday to persuade European leaders that they can do business with Beijing, even as the Chinese tried to keep faith with their unlimited partnership with Russia that has plunged Europe into war. But arriving in Berlin, Foreign Minister Qin Gang was quickly confronted about the war in Ukraine. Europe stands between two currents. Can it break free from dependence on the United States? Can it seek other economic opportunities while trying to implement what is called risk mitigations from China? Economy and security, national interests are put first. Reassurance mixed with warnings, dialogue and sanctions. Let's analyze the messages and calculations of the parties in today's World Affairs on FBNC. A trip by China's foreign minister this week to France, Germany, and Norway signals Beijing's intention to rebuild European Union relations as the bloc seeks to get out of the shadow of the war in Ukraine. Tensions between the EU and China have simmered over China's decision to abstain from United Nations resolutions condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. European leaders, including Macron, have called for China's involvement to help end the war. After the first phone call between Xi and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky last month, more than a year after the invasion began, Xi said China would send a delegation headed by Li Hui, Beijing's special representative on Eurasian affairs, to Ukraine and other countries to help with in-depth communication to find a political settlement to the crisis. Wang Yiwei, the China-EU expert, said Xin's trip was also aimed at creating an atmosphere for mediation on Ukraine. As China's preparation to send a special envoy for mediation is almost complete, the leadership is making efforts to resolve the Ukraine crisis and get China-EU relations back on track, said Wang Yiwei, a Renmin University professor who specializes in Europe studies. Neutrality means taking the side of the aggressor, and that is why our guiding principle is to make it clear that we are on the side of the victim, the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock declared at a joint news conference after they met. Beijing, she said, could be doing much more to help bring the war to an end. Mr. Jin defended his nation's approach. The Ukraine issue is of high complexity, he insisted. China did not cause this, nor is it a party, but we are committed to peace negotiations. While in Berlin on Tuesday, Jin pledged to work with relevant parties, including Germany, to seek a ceasefire for the war in Ukraine. China has proposed a set of weak proposals for a possible peace between Russia and Ukraine. Few take them very seriously, but some officials suggest that China may prove useful down the road in helping guarantee any ceasefire or settlement. Beijing has laid out a 12-point approach to the war and pledged to send a peace envoy for discussions in Europe in the coming weeks. However, European officials say they have seen no signs yet that Beijing is willing to do more than the minimum necessary to appear a part of the diplomatic process. China's leader Xi Jinping is seen as one of the few voices that President Vladimir Putin of Russia might heed. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has also spoken with Mr. Xi, who phoned him last month after much urging from the Ukrainian leader. But senior European and American officials do not believe that either Mr. Putin or Mr. Zelensky is ready for serious peace talks, or even that Mr. Xi is willing to press Mr. Putin for peace. They believe that China, given its rivalry with the United States, is eager for Mr. Putin not to be seen as losing his war and thereby risk losing power. Much will depend, as ever, on the situation on the battlefield after Ukraine wages a much-anticipated counteroffensive. Even if Ukraine gains considerable ground, US and European officials do not expect Russian troops to collapse or to flee from all sovereign Ukrainian territory. But if Ukraine has great success, it may be more willing to discuss a settlement. It is less clear that Mr. Putin will have any interest in doing so, believing that time is on his side, with the United States and larger NATO alliance growing tired of the long war. As the European Union considers another package of sanctions aimed at companies that supply Russia through third countries like Azerbaijan and Georgia, Mr. Qin warned against imposing sanctions on Chinese companies over Russia, saying it would take action to protect their interests. This week, the European Commission has proposed sanctions against 8 Chinese companies for supplying Russian firms with dual-use goods that can be used by Russia's military. Beijing cancelled a visit by German Finance Minister Christian Lindner, leader of Germany's Junior Free Democrats Party, at the last minute, citing scheduling reasons. Chinese officials have reacted sharply to the sanctions threat, warning of retaliation. While China is making every effort to promote peace, which is in Europe's interest, Europe gives a stab in the back in return, bullying China on economic issues. Wang Lutong, Director General of the Chinese Foreign Ministry's Department of European Affairs, said on Twitter, "Can't understand what Europe is up to." At Berlin on May 9th, Mr. Qin said that Chinese and Russian companies enjoy normal exchanges and cooperation, which should not be affected. Mr. Qin warned against imposing sanctions on Chinese companies over Russia, saying it would take action to protect their interests. It's obvious that China's main concern is the closer coordination between the EU and US on China, said Jean-Pierre Capestat, an emeritus professor of political science at Hong Kong Baptist University. That is why they are sending some reassuring messages, but also some threats. China's foreign minister is crisscrossing Europe this week in a bid to peel the continent away from the growing confrontation between Beijing and Washington, warning that European interests would be harmed by towing the US approach. A 3-capital trip by Qin Gang, his first solo trip to the region since becoming China's foreign minister, comes at a pivotal moment for China's relationship with the bloc. European leaders have been reluctant to join Washington's mounting confrontation with Beijing. Instead, they have emphasized diplomatic dialogue and trade while pushing back on Beijing's increasing assertiveness on the world stage. On Tuesday, Mr. Qin, who after France was to travel to Norway, emphasized Europe's key economic ties to China. China should be a key asset for Europe in combating challenges, he said, and we welcome Europe to further participate in the market and development opportunities of China, so that both Chinese modernization and the European integration process continue to prosper. Yet China's more aggressive foreign policy, tighter scrutiny of foreign companies at home, and political support for Russia have also caused a backlash in Europe. There is a growing push in Brussels to arm European capitals with greater powers to reduce economic dependencies on Beijing, an approach European officials are calling de-risking from Beijing. Some in Washington have called for a decoupling of Western economies from China. After a meeting with German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock in Berlin, Mr. Qin, previously Beijing's ambassador in Washington, said the real risks for Europe were being dragged into a Western confrontation with Beijing. If you de-China in the name of de-risking, you are also reducing opportunity, cooperation, stability, and development, Mr. Qin said at a press conference on Tuesday. Without naming the US directly, he warned of some countries waging a new Cold War by imposing unilateral sanctions and exporting inflation and fiscal crisis. These are the real risks that need to be taken seriously, he said. If this new Cold War is fought, not only the interests of China will be harmed, but Europe's interests will also be sacrificed. Mr. Qin's trip comes as EU foreign ministers prepare to gather in Sweden on Friday to discuss changes in the bloc's relations with Beijing and the challenges China poses. That is likely to include a first discussion among senior European officials on the bloc's position on Taiwan. When French President Emmanuel Macron visited China in early April, the two sides pledged to work closely together, and Mr. Macron distanced his country from Washington's stance on Taiwan. Macron said that Europe would be pursuing its own interests and strategic autonomy and not get caught up in crises that are not ours. He suggested that the fate of Taiwan was not a central issue for Europe and argued that Europe should not blindly follow the United States in its rivalry with China. Even if some read too much into Mr. Macron's words, they were music to Chinese ears, given Beijing's goal of trying to divide Europe from the United States. In Berlin on Tuesday, Mr. Qin hit some of the same themes that Mr. Macron did. China supports Europe's self-chosen development path, supports its European strategic autonomy, and it also maintains a steady and stable European policy, he said. Speaking in the European Parliament on Tuesday, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said the continent's relationship with China was increasingly characterized by rivalry and competition. He said Europe needed to look for new trade opportunities as the continent seeks to become less dependent on its commercial ties with Beijing, which amounted to 850 billion euros in 2022, with a sharp growing European trade deficit. No decoupling, but smart de-risking is the motto, he told EU lawmakers. There are some signs that economic ties between the two powerhouses are fraying on the margins. Chinese foreign direct investment in Europe reached a decade low of 7.9 billion euros in 2022, down 22% from the previous year, according to a report published this week by Rhodium Group, a New York-based advisory firm. That decline took Chinese investment in Europe to the same levels since 2013. Germany, Europe's industrial powerhouse, has sharply tilted its trade away from China and toward the U.S. in recent months. German exports to China declined 12% in the first 3 months of the year from a year earlier to 24.1 billion euros, while Germany's exports to the U.S. increased 14% over the same period to 39.6 billion euros, according to Germany's Federal Statistics Agency. Qin met German counterpart Annalena Baerbock in Beijing last month and would use this meeting to explore deeper cooperation. Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin said, adding that their relations had set the pace for the growth of China-Europe relations. Spokesman Wang Wenbin also said Qin would use his first meeting with Norwegian Foreign Minister Anniken Huitfeldt since he took office in December to build on recent momentum to advance bilateral relations. He said that while Qin chose to visit Norway, Beijing also hoped to improve relations with more of Northern Europe, especially since ties with Lithuania remained strained and Finland had become a member of NATO since the war in Ukraine began. Norway, a Scandinavian country that is influential in areas like the regulation of international waters, natural resources, and wealth funds, has been an active partner with China, especially in finance at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is crucial to Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. Dylan Low, an assistant professor of foreign policy at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, said if Qin's visit led to stepped-up relations with Norway, it could be a diplomatic victory for China, which is trying hard to fight France. While trade deals and investment would likely be the key issues discussed between China and France and Germany, a stalled EU-wide investment pact was highly unlikely to be rectified as it required the approval of the European Parliament. Jia Daozhong, professor of international political economy at Peking University School of International Studies, said that as power politics played out between Washington and Beijing, some EU countries would like to force more autonomy for Europe, and a visit by China's foreign minister demonstrates endorsement of the EU's goal. George Toledo, the EU's ambassador to China, said in Beijing on Tuesday that Qin's visit was a welcome step for both China and Europe. I think it's only natural that the foreign minister goes there. Talking is always good news, he said. And that has wrapped up our program today. Thanks for watching, and please tune in next time.